Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we leave behind the grand castles of kings, the shining armor of knights, and the heroic tales that fill the pages of medieval history. Instead, we step into a quieter and far lonelier corner of the Middle Ages, a place most people never think about, a place hidden behind city walls, whispered about in marketplaces, and avoided by respectable society. Tonight, we will explore the forgotten life of a medieval executioner's wife. When people imagine an executioner, they often picture a hooded figure standing on a scaffold, carrying out grim duties before a crowd of spectators. Yet history rarely speaks about the people who lived beside him, the woman who shared his home, the woman who raised his children, the woman who carried his family name. While the executioner was feared, his wife often lived under the same shadow. Though she committed no crime, many medieval communities treated her as an outcast simply because of her husband's profession. Imagine waking each morning in a small house built near the edge of town, not because you preferred the quiet, but because nobody wanted you living among them. Imagine walking through a crowded market only to watch conversations stop as you pass. Imagine seeing merchants hesitate before selling you food, bakers refuse to touch your coins, and neighbors cross the street to avoid speaking with you. Such experiences were not uncommon for executioners' families throughout medieval Europe. The Middle Ages were a world deeply concerned with honor, reputation, and social standing. People belonged to communities, guilds, and families that defined their place in society. Yet some professions existed outside these normal structures. Executioners occupied a strange position. Cities needed them. Lords relied on them. Courts could not function without them. Yet despite their importance, executioners were often viewed with suspicion and fear. Many people believed that anyone who regularly handled death, punishment, and torture carried a kind of social stain. That stain frequently extended to wives and children as well. For an executioner's wife, daily life could become an exercise in quiet endurance. She might spend her mornings preparing meals, cleaning the family home, or caring for children, just like countless other women of her time. Yet every ordinary task carried extraordinary complications. Finding friends could be difficult. Arranging marriages for children could be nearly impossible. Attending social gatherings often meant enduring uncomfortable stares and whispered conversations. The world constantly reminded her that she belonged to a family others preferred to keep at a distance. Yet history is rarely as simple as it first appears. While executioners were feared, they were also necessary. Some possessed specialized skills that few others had. Many served as surgeons, animal handlers, or medical practitioners because they understood anatomy better than most people. Their wives sometimes assisted in these activities, creating unusual opportunities unavailable to other medieval women. In certain towns, an executioner's wife might prepare medicinal remedies, care for the sick, or manage family businesses connected to her husband's work. These responsibilities could provide a degree of independence that was rare during the period. As we travel through tonight's story, we will explore the strange world surrounding medieval executioners and their families. We will walk through crowded marketplaces where gossip traveled faster than truth. We will visit lonely houses standing beyond city gates. We will witness public executions through the eyes of someone who could never truly escape them. We will examine the challenges of marriage, motherhood, friendship, and survival in a society that often judged people not by who they were, but by the profession of the man they married. Most importantly, we will discover the human story hidden beneath the history, because behind every executioner stood a family. Behind every feared profession stood ordinary people trying to build ordinary lives. And behind the shadow of the scaffold lived women whose stories have been largely forgotten by time. So settle in, relax, and allow the distant bells of a medieval town to guide you into another world. A world of stone streets, flickering candlelight, whispered rumors, and quiet resilience. Tonight, we follow the forgotten life of a medieval executioner's wife. A life lived in the shadow of death, yet filled with the same hopes, fears, and dreams that connect us all across the centuries. In a medieval town, a person's place in society was often determined long before they were born. Farmers raised children who became farmers. Blacksmiths trained sons to work the forge. Merchants passed their businesses from one generation to the next. Everyone belonged somewhere. Everyone had a place within the intricate web of medieval life. Yet there were a few families who existed outside these familiar patterns. Among them were the families of executioners. Imagine a small town somewhere in medieval Germany, France, or the Holy Roman Empire. Stone walls surround the settlement. A church bell rings in the distance. Merchants open their stalls in the marketplace as the first rays of sunlight touch the rooftops. Smoke rises from chimneys, and the town slowly awakens. But beyond the crowded streets and bustling square stands a solitary house. It sits near the edge of town, separated from the rest of the community by distance as much as by reputation. This is where the executioner and his family live. The woman who lives there begins her day much like any other medieval wife. She rises before dawn, lights the hearth, prepares food, and organizes the tasks that must be completed before nightfall. Chickens need feeding. Water must be carried from a nearby well. Bread dough must be prepared. Clothes require mending. On the surface, her life appears ordinary, yet every aspect of it is shaped by her husband's profession. Unlike other women in town, she is not likely to receive many visitors. Neighbors rarely stop by for casual conversation. Children are often warned to keep their distance from the executioner's family. Some people fear them. Others simply do not trust them. Many believe that anyone connected to death and punishment carries an invisible stain. It does not matter that the executioner's wife has committed no crime. In the eyes of society, she shares part of her husband's burden. As the morning progresses, she may hear the sounds of the town beyond the walls. Merchants shouting prices, blacksmiths striking hot iron, church bells calling the faithful to prayer. These sounds remind her of a community that she can see but never fully join. She belongs to the town, yet remains separate from it. Needed but not accepted. Known but not welcomed. Such isolation could last for years. In some places, executioners' families remained outsiders for generations. Their children often married within other executioner families because few others would accept them. Entire family lines developed that carried the profession from father to son and the stigma from mother to daughter. For the executioner's wife, this reality shaped every decision she made. She knew that her family's future would depend not only on hard work, but also on surviving the judgment of those around them. The woman had not always been an executioner's wife. Like everyone else, she had once been a young girl with hopes for the future. Perhaps she imagined marrying a craftsman, a merchant, or a farmer. Perhaps she dreamed of a comfortable life surrounded by friends and family. Yet life in the Middle Ages rarely followed dreams. Circumstances, necessity, and family arrangements often determine marriage more than romance ever could. How a woman came to marry an executioner varied from place to place. Sometimes she was the daughter of another executioner, raised within the same isolated social circle. Sometimes poverty left few alternatives. Occasionally, genuine affection developed between two people despite the difficulties that awaited them. Whatever the path, the decision carried consequences that would last a lifetime. The wedding itself might have been modest. There would be no grand celebration attended by the town's most respected families. Few people wished to be closely associated with an executioner's household. Even if guests attended, whispers often followed. People wondered why any woman would willingly enter such a life. They pitied her. Some judged her. Others simply avoided speaking about it altogether. Yet marriage brought practical realities that soon overshadowed public opinion. The executioner's wife became responsible for managing the household. Medieval homes required constant labor. Food had to be preserved. Clothing had to be repaired. Livestock needed care. Every day brought new challenges. Unlike noblewomen in castles or wealthy merchants' wives in prosperous cities, she could not rely on servants to perform most tasks. Her survival depended on her own effort. Over time, she also came to understand the strange contradictions of her husband's profession. The town feared him, yet relied upon him. People avoided him in public, yet city officials sought his services whenever punishment had to be carried out. He stood at the edge of society while performing duties that society considered essential. Living beside such a man required resilience. It required patience. And above all, it required the ability to endure loneliness. As evening settles over the town and candlelight flickers inside the small house beyond the walls, the young wife begins to realize the true nature of the life she has entered. The scaffold casts a longer shadow than she ever imagined. And this is only the beginning of her story. As the years passed, the executioner's wife learned that some of the hardest moments of her life did not occur near the scaffold or during public punishments. Instead, they happened during ordinary errands. A simple trip to the marketplace could become a reminder of her family's place in society. On a cool medieval morning, she wraps a wool cloak around her shoulders and begins the walk toward town. The streets are already busy. Farmers arrive with carts filled with vegetables. Bakers display fresh loaves of bread. Merchants arrange colorful fabrics imported from distant cities. The air smells of smoke, livestock, and freshly baked goods. At first glance, everything seems normal. Yet as she enters the marketplace, subtle changes occur. Conversations quiet for a moment. A few people glance in her direction before quickly looking away. Some merchants remain polite, but their smiles feel forced. Others serve her as quickly as possible, eager to end the interaction. No law requires such behavior. No official decree orders citizens to avoid her. Yet medieval society is governed as much by unwritten rules as by written ones. Reputation matters. Associations matter. And many people believe that anyone connected to executions should remain at a distance. She approaches a vegetable stall. The merchant sells her onions and carrots without issue, but she notices him carefully placing the coins aside rather than immediately mixing them with the others. Perhaps it means nothing, or perhaps it means exactly what she suspects. In another part of the market, two women stop talking when she walks past. A child stares openly until his mother pulls him away. Over time, these small moments become familiar. None are dramatic enough to provoke confrontation. None are severe enough to draw sympathy. Yet together they form a quiet wall separating her from the rest of the community. Still, she continues her errands. Life leaves little room for self-pity. Bread must be bought. Supplies must be gathered. The household depends on her efforts, and so she carries on, learning to ignore whispers and sideways glances as best she can. By the time she returns home beyond the town walls, her basket is full. Yet her heart feels slightly heavier than when she left. Such days are common. Tomorrow will likely be much the same. If life is difficult for the executioner's wife, it is often even harder for her children. At first, when her sons and daughters are very young, they notice little difference between themselves and other children. They chase one another through fields. They laugh at simple games. They explore streams and forests with endless curiosity. Childhood offers brief protection from the realities of adult society. But that protection never lasts forever. Eventually, they begin noticing things. Invitations that never arrive. Friendships that suddenly fade. Parents who discourage their children from visiting the executioner's home. Other boys and girls repeating harsh words they have heard from adults. The executioner's wife watches these moments with quiet sadness. She cannot shield her children from the truth forever. They must eventually understand that many people judge them not for who they are, but for who their father is. For medieval families, this problem extends far beyond childhood. Marriage is one of the most important events in a person's life, and suitable matches are often difficult to find. Many respectable families refuse to allow their children to marry into an executioner's household. As a result, executioner families across Europe frequently marry within a small social network of other executioner families, creating communities that remain isolated for generations. The mother worries about this constantly. She wants opportunities for her children. She wants them to have choices she never had. Yet she understands the limitations imposed by society. In the evenings, after the day's work is complete, the family gathers around the hearth. Firelight flickers against the walls while a simple meal cooks nearby. For a little while, the outside world feels distant. The children laugh. Stories are shared. Ordinary family moments unfold. These evenings become precious, because beyond the warmth of the hearth lies a world that rarely welcomes them. The executioner's wife knows that one day her children will have to face that world on their own. And as she watches them sleeping peacefully beside the fire, she wonders what kind of future awaits them. It is a question that keeps many mothers awake at night. But for the wife of a medieval executioner, the answer feels especially uncertain. For most people living in a medieval town, an execution was an event. For the executioner's wife, it was a day she could never escape. Long before sunrise, she often knew when such a day was coming. News traveled quickly through the town. A thief had been sentenced. A murderer had been condemned. A prisoner had been judged guilty by the local court. While merchants discussed the news with curiosity and townsfolk speculated about the crime, she thought about something else entirely. She thought about her husband. The morning began differently on execution days. The house felt quieter, more serious. The executioner checked his tools carefully. Contrary to popular belief, many executioners took their duties seriously. A skilled executioner was expected to perform the task quickly and professionally. Mistakes could cause unnecessary suffering and public outrage. His wife watched as he prepared himself. Sometimes they spoke very little. Years of marriage had taught them that certain days carried their own weight. There was nothing left to say. As the town square filled with spectators, the executioner's family remained painfully aware of what awaited. Children climbed onto barrels for a better view. Merchants sold food and drink. Crowds gathered as though attending a festival. The executioner's wife often found this difficult to understand. For many people, an execution was entertainment mixed with justice. For her, it was simply another reminder of the burden her family carried. She rarely attended the executions themselves. Some wives stayed away completely, others watched from a distance. Regardless of where she stood, she could never truly avoid them. The sound of church bells, the movement of crowds, the whispers afterward, all of it eventually reached her. By afternoon, the sentence had been carried out. The crowd dispersed. People returned to their normal lives. Yet for the executioner's family, the day did not simply end. The shadow of the scaffold followed them home. When her husband finally returned, he often carried a tiredness deeper than physical exhaustion. He had performed a duty the town demanded but did not respect. He had done work nobody else wanted to do. And tomorrow, the same people who required his service would likely avoid him in the marketplace. The executioner's wife understood this contradiction better than anyone. Medieval people lived in a world filled with superstition. Many believed that certain objects possessed hidden powers. Strange illnesses were blamed on curses. Unusual events were interpreted as signs from God. Stories of witches, spirits, and miracles circulated constantly. In such a world, it is perhaps unsurprising that executioners and their families became surrounded by rumors. The executioner's wife often found herself at the center of tales she had never heard before. Some people believed executioners possessed secret knowledge. Others claimed they practiced strange rituals. Certain townsfolk whispered that anyone who handled the dead too often became somehow different from ordinary people. Over time, these rumors spread to their families as well. A woman buying bread might suddenly stop speaking when the executioner's wife approached. Children sometimes stared at her as though she were a character from a ghost story. Travelers passing through town occasionally repeated exaggerated tales about executioners from distant cities. The truth was far less dramatic. Most executioners' wives spent their days performing ordinary tasks. They cooked meals, raised children, cleaned homes, worried about money. Yet ordinary lives rarely interested people as much as mysterious stories. Ironically, some executioner families learned to use these rumors to their advantage. Because executioners often possessed knowledge of anatomy and injuries, they sometimes treated wounds, set broken bones, or created herbal remedies. Their wives frequently assisted them. Desperate patients occasionally sought their help when traditional healers could not provide answers. This created a strange situation. The same people who avoided the executioner's wife at social gatherings might secretly visit her door when illness struck their household. Fear and necessity existed side by side. The wife learned to live with these contradictions. She understood that society's opinions could change depending on circumstance. One day people treated her as an outsider. The next day they sought her help. As evenings settled over the countryside and candlelight filled the small house beyond the walls, she reflected on the strange position her family occupied. They were neither fully accepted nor completely rejected, needed yet unwanted, feared yet occasionally respected. It was a lonely place to exist, and the years ahead would bring challenges far greater than rumors and whispered stories. As the years passed, the executioner's wife discovered that the hardest part of her life was not the scaffold, the executions, or even the whispers that followed her family through town. The hardest part was loneliness. In medieval towns, women formed close social circles that helped make daily life bearable. They gathered at wells, shared recipes, exchanged remedies for illnesses, attended church together, and supported one another during births, weddings, and funerals. These friendships often lasted a lifetime. Yet the executioner's wife found herself standing outside this world. Whenever she approached a group of women, conversations seemed to fade. Smiles became polite rather than warm. No one openly insulted her, but neither did they invite her into their lives. She would see neighbors laughing together while collecting water and wonder what it felt like to belong so naturally among others. She attended church services and community events, hoping that time might soften people's opinions, but little changed. To most townsfolk, she was not an individual with her own thoughts and feelings. She was simply the executioner's wife. Her husband's profession defined her reputation before she even spoke a word. Over time, she stopped expecting invitations. She learned to rely on herself and her family instead. Yet there were evenings when she sat beside the fire and imagined a different life. A life where neighbors visited freely, where friendships grew naturally, and where she was judged by her character rather than by her husband's work. Such thoughts were dangerous because they reminded her of everything she lacked. Still, they were impossible to avoid. One autumn night, a violent storm swept across the countryside. Rain hammered the rooftops, thunder rolled across the sky, and fierce winds shook the trees outside the executioner's isolated home. The family remained gathered around the hearth when a sudden knock echoed through the house. Visitors at night were uncommon. Visitors during a storm were even rarer. When the door opened, a frightened man stood in the rain. His wife had become seriously ill, and the town healer was nowhere to be found. Desperate and running out of options, he had come seeking help from the very family he normally avoided. Without hesitation, the executioner's wife began gathering herbs and preparing remedies, while her husband offered what medical knowledge he possessed. For hours they worked to help the stranger. During that time, something remarkable happened. The invisible walls separating them from the rest of society seemed to disappear. The desperate husband no longer saw an executioner's household. He saw people willing to help another family in need. The executioner's wife no longer felt like an outcast. She felt useful, respected, and valued. When the storm finally began to fade and the man returned home carrying medicine and hope, he thanked them repeatedly. By the next day, life in town would return to normal. People would continue whispering. Old prejudices would remain. Yet the executioner's wife never forgot that stormy night. It reminded her that beneath fear, gossip, and social barriers, human kindness still existed. And in a life often defined by isolation, even a single moment of acceptance could remain in her memory for years. For the executioner's wife, one of the greatest worries in life was not her own reputation but the future of her children. When they were very young, the world seemed simple. They chased one another through fields, played beside streams, and laughed without understanding the strange position their family occupied. But childhood never lasted forever. As the years passed, they slowly began noticing things. Other children were sometimes forbidden from visiting their home. Certain families kept their distance. Invitations to celebrations rarely arrived. The executioner's wife watched these moments with a heavy heart because she knew her children had done nothing wrong. Yet medieval society often judged entire families rather than individuals. She tried to teach them resilience. Around the evening fire, she told stories, encouraged them to work hard, and reminded them that their worth was not determined by the opinions of others. Still, she could not protect them from every disappointment. As her sons and daughters grew older, she began worrying about their futures. Would they find friends? Would they find suitable marriages? Would they be forced to inherit the same isolation that had followed their parents? These questions lingered in her mind during sleepless nights. Like many mothers throughout history, she wanted a better life for her children. Unlike most mothers, she knew society might never allow it. In many parts of medieval Europe, the profession of executioner often remained within the same family for generations. A son might inherit the role from his father not because he desired it, but because few other opportunities existed. Other trades were frequently closed to executioners' children. Guilds refused them. Merchants distrusted them. Respectable families avoided them. The executioner's wife understood this reality all too well. As her children approached adulthood, she saw the difficult choices awaiting them. Some families arranged marriages with the sons and daughters of other executioners living in distant towns. Entire networks of executioner families emerged across Europe, bound together by necessity rather than preference. The wife found this deeply saddening. She wanted her children to choose their own paths. Yet medieval society rarely granted such freedom. One evening, while watching her family gathered around the hearth, she realized how fragile their happiness truly was. The outside world saw them as different, but within those walls they laughed, argued, shared meals, and dreamed just like everyone else. The executioner's wife often wondered whether future generations would ever understand this simple truth. Behind the feared profession stood an ordinary family trying to survive. Behind the executioner's name stood children hoping for acceptance. And behind the shadow of the scaffold stood a mother quietly fighting for a future she feared might never come. As the executioner's wife grew older, she became increasingly aware of a strange contradiction that defined her family's existence. The townspeople feared her husband, avoided him, and often spoke about him in whispers. Yet whenever justice had to be carried out, whenever a criminal was sentenced, or whenever a difficult task arose that nobody else wished to perform, those same people turned to him without hesitation. The town could not function without an executioner. Courts required punishments to be enforced. Prisons required discipline. Public authority depended upon the certainty that sentences would be carried out. Everyone understood this, yet few were willing to acknowledge it openly. The executioner's wife often found herself wondering why people despised the man who performed duties they themselves demanded. Her husband did not create the laws. He did not decide guilt or innocence. He merely carried out the decisions of judges and rulers. Yet somehow he carried the burden of society's anger. Sometimes city officials treated him with respect in private while avoiding him in public. Wealthy merchants who would never invite him into their homes gladly relied upon his services when needed. The wife observed these contradictions year after year. Eventually she realized that her family occupied a unique position. They were essential to society yet excluded from it, needed but never embraced, respected for their usefulness but rarely for their humanity. It was a difficult lesson, one she carried quietly as she watched the world continue around her. One winter evening, as snow drifted across the rooftops and cold winds swept through the narrow streets, an unusual visitor arrived at the executioner's home. The wife was preparing supper when she heard a knock at the door. Visitors were uncommon, especially after sunset. When her husband opened the door, he found a wealthy merchant standing outside. The man looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if worried someone might see him there. He quickly explained that his son had suffered a serious injury while working and needed help. The town's physician was away, and rumors suggested that the executioner possessed practical medical knowledge. Such situations occurred more often than most people realized. Because executioners frequently dealt with injuries, anatomy, and physical punishment, many became surprisingly skilled healers. The executioner's wife assisted her husband as they treated the young man. Throughout the evening, the merchant remained polite and grateful. Yet the wife noticed something revealing. He behaved very differently inside their home than he did in public. Here, he spoke to them as equals. Here, he thanked them sincerely. Here, he showed genuine respect. By morning, his son was recovering, and the merchant departed with heartfelt gratitude. But the executioner's wife knew what would happen next. In the marketplace, the man would likely return to keeping his distance. Public reputation remained too important. As she watched him disappear down the snowy road, she reflected on how often people hid their true opinions behind social expectations. Many feared being associated with her family more than they feared hypocrisy itself. It was one more reminder that medieval society could be as complicated as it was unforgiving. Yet for a single evening, within the warmth of their small home, the barriers between them had briefly disappeared. And sometimes, those small moments of honesty felt more valuable than years of forced politeness. For most of her life, the executioner's wife had grown accustomed to her husband's presence. Whether he was repairing tools, tending animals, or returning from duties in town, he was always there, a constant figure in a world that often felt uncertain. Yet one spring, circumstances forced him to travel to a neighboring city for several days. A regional authority required experienced executioners to assist with a legal matter, and refusing such a request was not an option. For the first time in many years, the wife found herself managing everything alone. First, she welcomed the quiet. The house seemed peaceful without the constant reminders of her husband's grim profession. But as the days passed, she began noticing how vulnerable her position truly was. The townspeople who rarely spoke to her seemed even more distant. Merchants who normally dealt with her reluctantly became less cooperative. A few people appeared almost relieved that the executioner was absent. She realized that while her husband was feared, his presence also offered a certain protection. Few people dared openly mistreat his family while he remained nearby. Without him, she felt exposed. Every errand took longer. Every interaction felt colder. One evening, while carrying water home at sunset, she became painfully aware of how alone she was. The road beyond the town walls stretched silently before her. The distant sounds of the marketplace faded into the background. For a moment she wondered whether anyone in the town would truly care if she simply disappeared. The thought frightened her, not because she believed it entirely, but because part of her feared it might be true. When her husband finally returned several days later, she greeted him with unusual warmth. The experience had reminded her that despite all the burdens of their life together, they faced them as a family. In a world that rarely accepted them, they had become each other's greatest source of strength. Every year the town celebrated a religious festival that transformed the streets into a scene of excitement and joy. Colorful banners hung from buildings. Musicians filled the air with songs. Merchants sold special foods, and families gathered to celebrate together. Children eagerly awaited the event for weeks. For most residents, it was one of the happiest times of the year. The executioner's wife watched these celebrations from a distance. Technically, nobody forbade her from attending. She could walk through the streets like anyone else. Yet she knew she would never truly be part of the festivities. The smiles she received would be polite rather than genuine. Conversations would become awkward. Groups would subtly shift away. So instead of joining the crowds, she often observed from the edge of town. One particular year, she stood near a hill overlooking the festival. From there, she could see the marketplace filled with life. Children ran between stalls. Couples laughed together. Church bells rang proudly across the rooftops. The entire town seemed united in celebration. For a moment, she imagined herself among them. She imagined having close friends to greet, neighbors to visit, and invitations waiting for her at every gathering. It was a simple dream, one most people took for granted. Yet for her, it felt almost impossible. As the sun began to set, the festival lights flickered to life across the town square. Their warm glow illuminated the streets below while she remained standing in the growing darkness beyond the walls. It was a scene that perfectly reflected her life. Close enough to witness the happiness of others, too far away to fully share it. Eventually she turned and walked home. The laughter of the festival faded behind her as she returned to the small house where her family waited. There, beside the hearth, she found something the town could never provide: acceptance, love, and the quiet understanding of people who shared the same burden. Sometimes that had to be enough. For many years, the executioner's wife had worried about the future, loneliness, and the judgment of society. But like every family in the Middle Ages, there was one enemy she feared more than gossip or isolation: illness. Medieval life was fragile. A simple infection could become deadly. A fever that seems minor today could claim a life within days. One autumn, sickness entered the executioner's household. It began with one of the children developing a fever. At first, the family hoped it would pass. The wife prepared herbal remedies, changed damp cloths, and sat beside the child's bed through long nights. But the fever remained. As the days passed, exhaustion began taking its toll. The executioner's wife barely slept. She spent her nights listening to labored breathing and her days maintaining the household. The world outside seemed to disappear. The marketplace, the church bells, the distant gossip of neighbors. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the child lying in bed. During those difficult days, something unexpected happened. A woman from town arrived at their door carrying bread and broth. She was not a close friend. In truth, she had rarely spoken to the executioner's wife before, yet she had heard about the illness and decided to help. Soon another visitor arrived with herbs. Then an elderly widow offered prayers. The executioner's wife was stunned. For years she had expected rejection. Now, during one of the hardest moments of her life, a handful of people were showing kindness. The illness eventually passed, and the child recovered. But the memory of those visitors stayed with her. It reminded her that beneath society's prejudices, compassion still existed. Time moved quietly in the medieval world. Seasons changed. Children grew. Hair turned gray. Before she realized it, the executioner's wife was no longer a young woman. The years had left their mark. Her hands were rough from work. Fine lines appeared around her eyes. She moved a little slower than before. Yet age also brought wisdom. She had spent decades living on the edge of society. Decades enduring whispers, judgment, and loneliness. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped caring so much about what others thought. The opinions that once caused sleepless nights no longer carried the same power. She had survived too much to be troubled by every rumor. One evening, she sat outside her home, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of gold and red. The town stood in the distance beyond the fields. From there, she could hear faint sounds drifting through the evening air. children playing, dogs barking, church bells ringing. It was the same town that had never fully accepted her. Yet as she watched it from afar, she felt surprisingly peaceful. She realized something important. Her life had not been defined solely by exclusion. It had been filled with meaningful things as well. She had raised children, built a home, supported her family through difficult years, shared joys and sorrows with the people she loved. Society might never remember her name, but that did not mean her life lacked value. As darkness slowly settled across the countryside, the executioner's wife reflected on the journey behind her. She had once dreamed of belonging. Now she understood that belonging did not always come from the approval of others. Sometimes it came from the family waiting inside, the memories built over a lifetime, and the quiet knowledge that she had endured when many others would have surrendered. The years had taken much from her, but they had also given her something precious: perspective. As the years continued to pass, one concern remained in the executioner's wife's mind more than any other: the future of her children. Nowhere was this concern greater than when her eldest daughter reached the age for marriage. In medieval society, marriage was not simply a personal matter. It determined social standing, financial security, and often the course of an entire life. Most parents worried about finding a suitable match for their children, but the executioner's family faced challenges that few others understood. Many respectable households refused to consider marriages connected to executioners. The stigma extended across generations. The daughter could be kind, hardworking, and virtuous, yet many families saw only her father's profession. The executioner's wife watched her daughter grow into a capable young woman and felt both pride and sadness. She knew how much her child deserved happiness, yet she also understood the barriers standing in her path. Months passed as possible matches came and went. Some families politely declined. Others never responded at all. Then, eventually, news arrived from another town. A young man from a family connected to a similar profession had expressed interest. It was not the future the mother had once imagined for her daughter, but it offered stability and companionship. As the wedding day approached, she found herself reflecting on her own marriage many years earlier. The fears, the uncertainties, the hopes she had carried into adulthood. Watching her daughter prepare for a new life brought both joy and sorrow. She wanted to protect her from every hardship, yet she knew that every generation must walk its own path. On the day of the wedding, as church bells rang softly across the countryside, the executioner's wife stood quietly among the guests. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Perhaps her daughter would find happiness despite the burden society placed upon their family. The medieval world often seemed unchanging, but even the oldest towns evolved over time. New generations grew up. Old prejudices weakened. People who had once feared the executioner's family died, and younger townsfolk sometimes viewed them differently. The executioner's wife began noticing subtle changes. A merchant who had once been cold now greeted her politely. Children no longer stared quite as openly. Some townspeople even sought her advice because of the medical remedies she had learned over the years. These were small changes, easy to overlook, yet they mattered. They suggested that perhaps society was not as fixed as she had once believed. The wife understood that her family would never become truly popular or fully accepted. Some barriers remained too deeply rooted in medieval culture, yet she could feel a gradual softening in attitudes. Perhaps people had grown accustomed to her presence. Perhaps years of reliability and hard work had earned a measure of respect. or perhaps age itself had changed how others viewed her. Whatever the reason, life felt slightly less lonely than it once had. One evening, while walking through the marketplace, she realized something remarkable. She was no longer afraid of what people thought. The whispers that had once wounded her seemed distant and unimportant. She had spent too many years surviving hardship to worry about every judgmental glance. The town had shaped her life, but it no longer controlled her peace of mind. As she returned home beneath the fading light of sunset, she felt a quiet sense of victory. Not the kind celebrated in songs or remembered by history, but a personal victory earned through endurance. She had survived decades on the margins of society. She had raised a family, protected her children, and built a life despite every obstacle placed before her. And in that moment, she realized that was an achievement greater than most people would ever know. Time spared no one in the medieval world. The executioner's wife had watched her children grow into adults. Seasons pass one after another, and familiar faces disappear from the town forever. Now she found herself watching the person who had stood beside her through it all begin to age. Her husband was no longer the strong man who could spend an entire day working without rest. Years of physical labor had left their mark. His hair had turned gray, his movements had slowed, and the duties that once seemed routine now required greater effort. The wife noticed these changes long before he admitted them himself. Every morning he took a little longer to prepare for the day. Every evening he seemed slightly more tired. Yet, despite the difficulties, he continued performing his duties because the town still relied upon him. One evening, as they sat together beside the hearth, they spoke about the past. They remembered the early years of marriage, the loneliness, the struggles of raising children, and the countless obstacles they had overcome. For the first time in many years, the executioner's wife realized how much of her life had been shared with this man. Society had judged them together. They had endured hardship together. Whatever others thought of him, he had always been her companion. The years had transformed fear into familiarity and uncertainty into loyalty. As winter approached, she found herself appreciating the quiet moments they shared more than ever before. The future felt uncertain, but the memories they had built together remained. Eventually, a day arrived that the executioner's wife had always known would come. Her husband could no longer continue his work. Age and exhaustion had finally caught up with him. The authorities would need a younger man to take over the duties he had performed for so many years. The transition felt strange. For decades, the executioner's profession had defined their place in society. It had shaped where they lived, how others treated them, and what opportunities their family received. Now suddenly that chapter was ending. The wife expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt something more complicated. The profession had brought hardship, but it had also given structure to their lives. Without it, the future felt unfamiliar. The town slowly adjusted to the change. A new executioner arrived. People directed their attention toward another family. For the first time in many years, the wife noticed that fewer whispers followed her through the marketplace. Fewer curious glances lingered. It was as though society had quietly begun moving on. Yet she could not move on so easily. The profession had shaped nearly every aspect of her adult life. It had determined where she lived, whom she befriended, and how she was treated. Now she found herself entering a new stage of life, one she had never truly imagined. On a peaceful evening, she sat outside her home watching the sun sink below the horizon. The fields stretched quietly before her, and the distant town glowed in the fading light. For the first time in decades, she wondered who she was beyond the title of executioner's wife. It was a difficult question, but perhaps after all these years, she was finally free to discover the answer. The years after her husband's retirement felt strangely quiet. For most of her adult life, the executioner's wife had lived beneath the constant shadow of his profession. Every execution, every rumor, every judgmental glance from the townspeople had become part of her daily existence. Now that chapter was slowly fading into the past. The scaffold still stood outside the town, but it no longer belonged to her family. Another man now carried out those grim duties. Another household lived beneath the burden they had carried for so many years. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar. She would wake in the morning expecting the same routines that had defined decades of her life, only to remember that everything had changed. Her husband spent more time at home, tending a small garden, repairing tools, or simply sitting beside the fire. Together they entered a stage of life neither had expected to reach. For the first time, they had the opportunity to live more like ordinary people. Yet the past was not so easily forgotten. Whenever she walked through town, she still recognized faces that remembered who they were. Some people continued keeping their distance out of habit. Others seemed unsure how to treat her now that her husband no longer held the position. The executioner's wife found these reactions almost amusing. Society had spent so many years defining her by a role that no longer existed. But as the seasons passed, something remarkable happened. The whispers became quieter. The stares became less frequent. Younger generations knew little about the family that had once lived under the shadow of the scaffold. Time, it seemed, was slowly doing what she had never thought possible. It was allowing people to forget. One evening, as autumn leaves drifted across the countryside and the sky turned gold with the setting sun, the executioner's wife sat outside her home, reflecting on the life she had lived. She thought about the young woman she had once been, the girl who had dreamed of acceptance, friendship, and belonging. She thought about the years of loneliness, the endless gossip, the fears she had carried for her children, and the countless times she had wondered whether life would ever become easier. Looking back, she realized something surprising. Despite all the hardships she had endured, more than that, she had built a life. She had raised a family, cared for those she loved, survived difficult years, and found moments of happiness where many would have seen only despair. History would never record her name. Chroniclers would write about kings, wars, and noble families. They would describe executions, but rarely the people forced to live alongside them. Yet her life had mattered just as much as theirs. She understood this now. Every ordinary act of kindness, every sacrifice for her children, every difficult day she survived had shaped the world around her in ways history books would never mention. As darkness slowly settled across the fields, she listened to the familiar sounds of the countryside, the distant ringing of church bells, the rustling of trees, the faint voices drifting from the town beyond the horizon. For the first time in many years, she felt at peace. Not because the world had changed, but because she no longer needed its approval. She had spent a lifetime searching for acceptance from others, only to discover that true peace came from accepting her own story. And as she watched the final light disappear from the sky, she knew that while history might forget her name, the life she had lived was still worth remembering. The final years of the executioner's wife's life arrived quietly, much like the falling snow that covered the countryside each winter. There were no grand ceremonies, no celebrations, and no historians recording her story. She spent her days much as she always had, tending the home, speaking with family, and watching the world continue without her. Many of the people who had once whispered about her were gone now. Some had died, others had moved away. New generations filled the town, and most of them knew little about the fears and prejudices that had shaped her youth. The woman who had once been treated as an outsider had become simply an elderly widow living peacefully beyond the town walls. Sometimes she sat beside the window during long winter evenings, watching snowflakes drift across the fields. The sight often reminded her of the passing years. She thought about her children, now adults with families of their own. She thought about her husband and the strange life they had shared together. Most of all, she thought about how differently everything had turned out from the dreams she once held as a young girl. Yet she felt no bitterness. Life had not been easy, but it had been hers. She had faced hardships that many people could not imagine and survived them all. As the cold months passed and another spring approached, she found herself spending more time reflecting than worrying. The fears that once kept her awake at night had lost their power. What remained were memories, some painful, some beautiful, all of them part of the story she carried within her. When her life finally came to an end, the world did not stop. The marketplace remained busy. Church bells continued ringing. Merchants sold their goods. Farmers worked their fields. History moved forward just as it always does. Yet somewhere within that ordinary world, the story of the executioner's wife quietly lingered. Not because people remembered her name, but because countless women throughout history had lived lives similar to hers. Women who stood beside men carrying difficult burdens. Women who endured judgment they did not deserve. Women whose stories were rarely written down because historians focused on kings, battles, and great events instead. The executioner's wife became one of those forgotten people who helped shape history without ever appearing in its pages. She left behind no famous achievements, no monuments, and no legends. Yet she left something perhaps more important. She left proof that ordinary people possess extraordinary strength. She had spent a lifetime living on the edge of society, facing loneliness, prejudice, uncertainty, and hardship. Through it all, she continued moving forward. She raised a family, built a home, found moments of happiness where others saw only darkness. And so, as our journey comes to an end, we leave her where history left her. In a small house beyond the town walls, beside the people she loved, watching the seasons pass. The world may have forgotten her name, but her story remains. A quiet reminder that behind every famous figure in history stood countless ordinary lives just as meaningful, just as human, and just as worthy of being remembered. And as the last candle burns low and the distant church bells fade into the night, the forgotten life of a medieval executioner's wife finally comes to rest.